In this lesson, we're going to talk about, have you filled in your quantity breakdown list? I call it the QBL. It's very similar to a purchase order, but I don't refer to it as a purchase order because it scares people. When people hear the word purchase order, they think, well, I'm not ready to purchase anything. I understand. But what comes first, the chicken or the egg? If you have your QBL ready, it will help you significantly in your first meeting with factories. Allow me to explain. So we're going to just talk about the importance of a QBL, how to use it, and then we're going to review parts of it. Think of your first meeting with the factory. The factory will ask you, what quantities do you want to produce? And you must answer confidently. And one of the easiest ways to answer is by having it written out on paper. Whatever you do, don't put the question back on them. That's a rookie mistake. And that's why I explained earlier in the course that you should reverse engineer your MOQ before you go to a factory. And this quantity breakdown list will help you lay out all the information clearly for the factory. I've seen it happen more than once where the people who did prepare their quantity breakdown presented it to the factory owners and then the salespeople at the factory, and they actually spent 3 to 5 minutes studying in detail the quantity breakdown list, and then they started asking questions based on what was written on the quantity breakdown list, and it allowed the conversation to move forward very quickly, because all the information on the quantity breakdown list is what they need to know in order to decide to move forward with you or not. One of the most important things that the factories need to know are not just the MOQ per piece or by pieces, but they need to know the MOQs, the minimum order quantities for fabrics, fabric color, and embellishments. They also want to know if your order is what I call a headache order or not, because the more complicated the order is, the more time and money they'll have to invest up front to get you to a point where you will approve the pre-production samples and make a deposit. And if the order is too complicated, they will back out. And by looking at the quantity breakdown list, they can quickly make a go, no-go decision. So here you see what the quantity breakdown list looks like. At the top, you have just basic information, your name, you're the customer, the factory name, the factory that you're meeting, and then the collection name. Could be, first collection, second collection, or maybe you have a name for your collection. Then follow me along as we go through each column. So the far left is the number, and then you have the description. I'm always surprised at when I ask people to talk about the quantity breakdown. I show it to them for the first time, and I ask them, how many styles do they have? And they'll say, oh, I have 3 or 4 styles. And I say, okay, well, how are we going to differentiate the different styles so that we can have an intelligent conversation? Do you have names for the different styles? And they don't. And so it makes it kind of hard to keep track of the conversation when we're talking about the different styles. So my first piece of advice is, before you talk to a factory, just come up with names. It might be as simple as style number 1, style number 2, style number 3, style number 4. But have that nomenclature thought out in advance, written on a piece of paper, so that you can have an intelligent conversation and distinguish between the different styles. Then the second column is fabric description. In a perfect world, you'll only have one kind of fabric that will apply to all the styles. And if the factory sees that, that's a green flag. And it just means that it's going to be a relatively easy order compared to if you have 5 styles and 5 different fabrics, right? The next column is fabric color. Let's say you're doing 1 t-shirt, or let's say you're doing 5 t-shirts, 1 type of fabric, but 20 colors. That can get complicated. And your quantity breakdown list, your matrix, will be much longer. So you might have to modify this QBL in that case. And the QBL that I provide in this course is an Excel file, and I encourage you to modify it to your specific scenario. But, fabric color is very important, and the breakdown. And don't just put black, blue, and white. Try to put in the Pantone colors to be specific. The next column is embellishment. So you might have screen print, you might have sublimation print, you might have embroidery, you might have sequins that are different for the different styles. And making that crystal clear on the quantity breakdown list will help the factory understand what it is they're expected to do, and as I said, how complicated or not complicated the order is. And the Best example I like to use is, let's say you're just doing screen print and you've got Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, and Donald Duck. So you've got 3 different prints. And let's just say it's the same style, the same fabric, and say 2 colors, but then you've got 3 different prints. And each print goes with each color. So you can imagine how that will look in a matrix format and how much longer. It'll basically be 3 times 2, right? So like if you've got 2 fabrics but 3 prints, that's 2 times 3, 6 variations. And you need to spell that out in this quantity breakdown list. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, does the size breakdown matter? It doesn't matter. The factories can do any size breakdown that you ask them to do. Size breakdowns are usually done in a bell curve, and medium is in the middle. It's usually the highest quantity, and then you go out along the bell curve and you've got your small and your large, which are going to be lower quantity than the medium, but higher than XL and or XS and XL. That takes us to the total pieces per style, per fabric, per color, per embellishment. And that all the squares in yellow is what the factories are really looking at. And if you do this quantity breakdown list correctly, the numbers will be crystal clear. And then at the very bottom in the green square is the total pieces. And that's also very important to the factories because their logic is very simplistic. They're looking at total number of pieces, average make price, target price, or FOB price, and then they know about between 5 to 20% what their margin, their profit, their net profit margin is, and they just do the math. They just take the total pieces times the average FOB price times the net percent profit that they'll make on each piece, and then they come up with a number, and that's how much net profit they'll make on this order. And then they'll have to calculate how much money do they have to invest to help you with the development to get you to a point where you approve the pre-production sample and make a deposit. That's the logic that they're going through, and having this filled out correctly helps them get to the conclusion they need, get the information they need to make the decision whether or not to continue with you. So another piece of advice is when you do this quantity breakdown, do 3 different scenarios. You have the quantity, your target MOQ based on previous lesson where we reverse engineered your MOQ based on your capital investment. And so do a quantity breakdown list based on that MOQ that you, and then do another quantity breakdown list with say maybe 50% less, so like really small, and then do another quantity breakdown list with a larger 50% or like 150% of MOQ that you want, so that you have 3 quantity breakdown lists at 3 different scenarios. And when you first meet the factory, my advice, assuming that you want to do small quantity, present the quantity breakdown list with the largest MOQ, because that will give the factory a warm, fuzzy feeling and kind of set the tone for the meeting, because their first impression will be, wow, this guy wants to do X number of quantities. With this quantity, we'll be able to make enough profit to cover our development costs, and they'll have an open mind to keep the conversation going. And then you wait till later in the first conversation where you say, oh, by the way, we'd like to start off with a test order before we commit to the bigger order. And then you present your other quantity breakdown list. You might go with the ultra small quantity or the quantity that you want. And of course, the factory will be a bit uncomfortable, and they'll feel like they've been manipulated or cheated. But you can ask. There's no harm in you asking, and you just evaluate how they respond. And factories understand that doing a smaller test order is reasonable, and so they won't be that surprised. Actually, it's just they'll have to do the calculations again in their head and decide whether or not they want to move forward. Then at the bottom you have the delivery date, so just put it in there clearly so that you don't have to speak it out, and the factory will see it and understand, and they'll quickly be able to look at their current production schedule and give you an answer. Yes, we can meet that delivery date, or no, we can't. And then you can use that as a bargaining tool. If they say they cannot meet it, or then you can say, well, we're willing to take a later delivery, and you ask them what would be the soonest you'd be able to deliver. And then you can make a note and then that part of the discussion is done. You can also talk about the preferred payment terms. It's the typical payment terms is 30% deposit and then 70% after final inspection before shipment. And then just use that as a way to open the discussion about payment terms. If they agree, great. If they don't, then listen to what they have to say. If it's acceptable to you, just make a note and then check that off and move on to the next topic, which is the destination country and port. A lot of times they'll ask that in the first meeting, because there's a big difference between shipping to Nigeria or Russia versus shipping to the US or Canada. So just go ahead and write it in there. And especially if you're shipping to multiple locations, maybe you're selling into the US and you're selling into Amazon Europe. So you'd have split shipment into US and Europe. So write it in there so that they see it, and if they have any questions about it, they'll respond or they'll talk about it. And then finally, in the far right corner is the HS codes. We'll talk about HS codes in a later lesson, but basically for every style, there has to be an HS code. And I recommend you do your homework before you meet the factory and you put the HS codes in there. The factory will see it and they're like, wow, these guys have done their homework, they're well prepared, and that will give the factory a warm, fuzzy feeling that they're dealing with somebody who's on the ball. So in summary, I created this QBL because based on my experience of being in many first meetings with factories, I feel all the information that's inside the quantity breakdown list is critical information that the factory needs in order to decide whether they want to work with you or not. So I highly recommend you study it and learn it. So in the next lesson, we're going to talk about quality control checks. See you there.